Welcome to the podcast for Module 4. This will also be the first stop on our grand tour. We're going to begin with some prehistoric art. So, of course, this is artwork that was created by civilizations that left no written records. And it's the only way that we know about these civilizations, really, because it's all that they left behind. So the art is really going to be interpreting these ancient, long-lost cultures to us. And we're going to begin with what's called Paleolithic art. This is some of the earliest art that's ever been created, and of course the word Paleolithic comes from the words paleo, meaning old, and lithos, meaning stone. And this is also known as the Old Stone Age. And we're going to begin this grand tour stop in the caves of Western Europe, and we're going to hang out there for a while. As we look at these examples of Paleolithic art, I want you to think about a couple of things. First, this art, although we don't know the exact purposes for all of it, was most likely functional, not decorative. Most of the time we think of art as something just beautiful and kind of useless and decorative that we can just have around our house to make our lives more beautiful. But for most of history, art that has been made has been for a purpose. It's been functional. And our best guess is that is the case with the people who made this art. The second point to think about is pretty interesting. It's that most of this art is really recently discovered. The first cave paintings were discovered in 1879, and that is not very long ago. The most recent one that we're going to look at was discovered in 1994, which of course is even closer to us in time. And it's a fascinating and tantalizing thought to think of what art is still out there, hidden in caves for us to discover. So here we go. Let's start in a place called the Chauvet Cave. This is named after the explorer who discovered it in 1994. This right here, ladies and gentlemen, is the oldest known painting that is in existence. There may be older ones out there. We haven't discovered them yet. This dates from around 30,000 BC, so around 32,000 years ago. And like most cave paintings, it consists of animals. In this case, it almost seems like a herd of animals charging from right to left. And we see in this painting what artists have wrestled with from the very beginning and what art students still wrestle with. That is the question of how do you take something that is three-dimensional in real life that you see in front of you and portray it on a two-dimensional surface, in this case, the wall of a cave. And the answer to that, at least for these ancient people, is by portraying a side view of the animal, putting the animal in profile. And that, of course, is something we're going to see in a lot of these cave paintings, these profile animals. The Chauvet cave paintings show us several different animals. One of the things we see in this first slide is the heads of what appear to be a lot of large cats, perhaps maneless lions. We see at the bottom some sort of horned animal, a bull or bison perhaps, something that almost looks like an elephant on the left. And if we look at the second slide, there is a rhinoceros. So there's a good variety of different types of animals portrayed here. We also see the print of a hand. This is something we sometimes run into in examples of ancient painting. And this is created by the artist placing his hand on the wall of the cave and filling his mouth with some sort of pigment, or perhaps blowing pigment through a straw, and blowing this on top of his hand, and it leaves a negative imprint behind on the cave wall. Staying in France, let's look at another example of really famous cave paintings. These are called the Lecaux cave paintings. And they were discovered in 1940, and they're from about 15,000 BC, which really puts the Chauvet paintings in perspective, right? Because if for a while the oldest cave paintings we had were 15,000 years old, suddenly you have these paintings that are 30,000 years old. That pushes back the age of cave painting by doubling it. I mean, it's really amazing. So for a long time, the Lecaux cave paintings were the oldest ones we had. They were discovered in 1940 by some French teenagers and their dog. I think their dog disappeared into a hole in the side of a hill, and they chased it in there and discovered these amazing paintings. Now, if you look at the second slide, which is a close-up of some of the paintings that you see in the first slide, you see the way the animals sort of overlap we have this large bull shape kind of outlined overlapping some other animals that are painted under it. And this suggests perhaps that these paintings were done at different times, maybe even over thousands of years, in different styles. And once again, of course, here we have the side view or profile view of the animal being shown. We have all four legs being displayed. And we have an interesting thing going on with the horns, because if it was truly a side or profile view, we should only see like one horn, but it's what we call a composite perspective. It's a little bit twisted. It's almost as if the two horns on the front of the head have been shifted from how they actually look in order to get across the idea of this bull having two horns. The last example of Paleolithic cave painting we're going to look at occurs in Spain, the famous Altamira cave paintings. These are the youngest cave paintings that we're going to study, dating from 12,000 BC, a mere 14,000 years old. Yet they were the cave paintings that were discovered first. They were discovered in 1879 by a Spanish nobleman named Marcelino de Satuola. Satuola was an amateur archaeologist, and he was exploring some caves on his property with his little daughter. And they were deep in the recesses of these caves, really far back, and this one passageway they were in was filled with rubble. And Satuola was having to stoop over to make his way through the passage, but his daughter, being much shorter, was able to stand up straight and look all around her. And as they were moving through, she saw the light of the lantern flickering on the ceiling of this cave, and she suddenly saw these animals appear. She said, "Daddy, look at all the animals." And he said, "What are you talking about? Are you crazy?" And sure enough, he squats down and looks up, and he sees all of these bison painted on the ceiling of his cave. Bison that are lying down, bison that are standing up, bison that seem to be tumbling. And he announces these findings to the world, and initially they are dismissed as a hoax. He is accused of being a fraud, and he spends a lot of his life trying to prove to people he's not a fraud. And most experts think these are a hoax until some other paintings are discovered in nearby caves that have mineral deposits that have grown over them. And of course, if that's the case, if you have these calcifications that took thousands of years to form, then the paintings under them must be even older than that. So eventually he was vindicated. Now, Altamira is like a celebration of the bison. There are tons and tons and tons of bison. We don't quite have the same variety of animals that we had in Chauvet. But nonetheless, all these paintings sort of exert a hold on the imagination. Now, in all these paintings we looked at, there are some really weird things. Most of these paintings are deep within the recesses of the caves. They're far away from the mouth of the cave, where you would have sources of light from the sun shining in. And that has led to a lot of speculation on the part of archaeologists as to the purpose of these paintings. It seems if they were simply made for decoration, you would place them near the mouth of the cave where you could look at them more easily and where you have natural light illuminating them. So the fact that these paintings are placed deep in hidden passageways in places where light can't reach has led some people to hypothesize that they are there for magical reasons, for functional purposes. And there are a whole lot of theories that have been suggested for the function of these paintings. Some of the paintings seem to have places where chunks have been taken out of them, as if they have been gouged with perhaps a spear or a tool after they were painted. And so some archaeologists believe that maybe there's some sort of magic going on here, some sort of attempt to capture the animal's spirit before going on a hunt. Others have suggested that these paintings were made to ensure fertility, to ensure that there would be lots of animals available. Still, other theories hold that these are for purposes of training and identification, so hunters can identify species. Others have suggested target practice. The fact is, we don't know. They definitely seem to be more than decoration, but their purposes are shrouded in mystery and probably always will be because we will have no written records to confirm why these paintings were made. Here's our next item in the Paleolithic Hall of Fame. This is a little tiny sculpture that has come to be known as Venus of Willendorf. It is about 4 inches tall. It's really, really small. It's really old, up to 25,000 years old. And this is carved out of limestone by some anonymous sculptor, prehistoric sculptor. And if you look at this figure, look at the things that are emphasized. It has really wide hips. The breasts are really big. In fact, if you look closely, there are little tiny arms that are folded on top of the breasts. The figure is pretty anonymous, practically faceless. There appears to be some sort of hat it's wearing and just a little tiny eye that's peeking out of the hat. There's the genitals are carefully carved in there. The navel is very prominent. All these clues have led scientists to believe this is possibly some sort of fertility figure, some sort of little statue that was produced to ensure success in childbearing for the people who made it, to ensure maybe even good crops for that year, or lots of animals, because all the features in this small limestone sculpture seem to be related to mothering and fertility and sustaining life. Again, we don't know. That's our best guess. But it seems reasonable, and if it's true, then again it points to this idea that the earliest art was thought in the minds of its makers to be functional. If this is indeed a fertility figure, then it was probably believed to have some sort of magical properties. This is called Venus of Willendorf because it was found in Willendorf, Austria. And since it was assumed to be a fertility figure, some archaeologists decided to give it the name of the goddess of love. All right, let's look at one more prehistoric structure. This is Stonehenge. It's what we call a Neolithic structure, meaning, of course, New Stone Age, from around 2500 BC. And the thing to understand about Stonehenge is that there are many things kind of like it all throughout the British Isles. It's not unique in the sense that it's the only circle of standing stones in the UK. There are quite a few of these circles of stones called cromlechs that are standing. Stonehenge is just the most famous. It has the most romance and mystery associated with it. For years, people have wondered how it was built, what its purpose was, and that sort of thing. And there are as many theories out there as you have people who wonder about mysterious things. Of course, there are theories that aliens helped build it, that Merlin himself helped construct Stonehenge, but we don't really know. The construction of Stonehenge consists of a repeated structure called a trilithon. This is 2 vertical stones set into the ground with a horizontal stone on top of them. It's a structure also known as a post and lintel, the posts being the 2 vertical parts and the lintel stone being the thing lying across the top. This is a very old method of construction. You see this in a lot of early and ancient houses. Stonehenge, originally when it was all still standing, consisted of an exterior circle of trilithons and then an inside horseshoe-shaped region or section of trilithons. And people have noticed for years that at certain times of the year, certain stones line up with different astronomical features. So one of the theories about this place is that it, at least in part, functions as a sort of celestial calendar. But again, we don't know. The people who built Stonehenge didn't leave any records about why they built it or really how. It's all conjecture, like a lot of prehistoric art. Kind of a side note here, I gotta be really honest, I've been to Stonehenge a couple of times and I found it to be kind of anticlimactic. I think there are better ways to use your time if you're in Great Britain for not very long. There's the way it's set up, you can't wander among the stones. There's sort of a gravel pathway all the way around it and you can observe it from a distance, and that's kind of it. So I don't want to discourage you from seeing it if you go to England, but it's just kind of okay. There are other places I'd rather spend my time. Every time I see a picture of Stonehenge, I think anticlimactic. And on that note, let's move to another part of the world. We're going to go down to the Middle East and hang out in Mesopotamia for a little bit. And here we're going to start engaging some civilizations that actually did leave written records. So they are not prehistoric. There are places where some of the first written records are kept. We're going to go to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, a Greek word for the land between the rivers. And if you've ever taken any sort of history or Western Civ class, you probably know which rivers those are. This map shows you the Tigris and Euphrates River, and it really emphasizes the importance of those two rivers in this desert environment. These rivers provide water for sustaining crops, for irrigation of fields. And it's here that people really settle down and start creating cities. They farm on much larger scales than have ever happened before. No longer are these people the wandering nomads or hunter-gatherers of other places in the world. Here, folks are finally settling down, raising lots of crops, watering those crops using these rivers, and creating some pretty major cities and civilizations. And if you look at this map, you'll probably see some pretty familiar names on it. There's Babylon, Nineveh. If you've been in Bible classes, you've probably heard some of these before. So I just want to spend some time looking at the chief Mesopotamian contribution to architecture, and that is the ziggurat. Here's a picture of what's known as the Great Ziggurat of And in order to understand the purpose of a ziggurat, you really need to delve into Mesopotamian culture some. This is a culture whose religion centers around agriculture and fertility. And the deities these people pray to are nature deities. And their prayers and their supplications typically revolve around asking for there to be good rain so the rivers will be swollen so they can have crops. So again, this theme of fertility that we've seen in some of this other artwork continues with the Mesopotamians. At any rate, in Mesopotamian cities, the city is sort of dominated by a temple that is on top of a ziggurat. A ziggurat is really nothing more than a platform, a stepped or terraced platform on which a temple sits. And this next picture shows a kind of vintage photo reconstruction of a ziggurat. I love this image because it's so old school. It's so obviously before Photoshop. It's all airbrush looking. Kind of has this nostalgic charm to it. But you can see up on top is the temple. And this is the domain of the priests and the people who are carrying out whatever ritual sacrifices were associated with their religion. And again, the ziggurat is not a tomb. It is simply a platform on which the temple sits. Now, ziggurats are actually constructed out of bricks. Bricks made of clay or mud and either fired or baked in the sun. So when we look back at the image of the Great Ziggurat at the actual only remaining part of the original ziggurat is peeking over the top. The rest of it is a reconstruction that was done in the 80s and 90s by Saddam Hussein's regime, because this is actually, in fact, located in modern-day Iraq. And ziggurats have an interesting tie-in into biblical history, because there are theories that the Tower of Babel featured in the Bible was actually a large ziggurat, and that seems to make sense if you listen to the language. Here's some excerpts from Genesis chapter 11, starting in verse 1. Now the whole world had one common language and one common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." And of course, if you remember your Bible stories, you know the rest of the story. God comes down and scatters their languages, because obviously these people are prideful and trying to sort of build their way up to heaven. And that place is called Babel because the Lord confused the languages of the whole world there, and everyone scattered from there. So here is a painting by Peter Bruegel, and you can see it's a fanciful depiction of the Tower of Babel under construction, being built up to the heavens. I remember seeing this painting when I was a kid, or a painting similar to it, just being fascinated by it. And notice that even though Bruegel is not attempting to make an archaeologically correct statement about what the Middle East looked like and maybe exactly what the Tower of Babel was like historically, it's kind of similar to a ziggurat. It has that stepped or terraced sort of construction to it. I just find that really interesting. Next stop, another ancient civilization that left written records, so we know quite a bit about them. And that, of course, is ancient Egypt. Very old civilization, dating back to around 3000 BC. And I want to start with an image of the Nile River that really demonstrates its importance to the ancient Egyptians. You can see in this satellite photo from space, the Nile cuts a winding path through the desert before fanning out into a massive delta as it approaches the Mediterranean. And for the ancient Egyptians, the Nile is going to be a big deal. For them, it's literally a source of life. It's flowing through regions that don't see a single drop of rain for a decade or more. And it provides the main source of water that turns this rather arid land into a pretty fertile land. And every year the Nile floods, and very rich soil comes washing down out of the mountains of Africa. And the soil is, of course, deposited on the banks of the Nile. And this allows for cities to be built, for crops to be harvested, and in many ways provides just the source of life for the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians looked at nature all around them as happening in cycles. So you have the flooding of the Nile happening every year. You have the sun rising every morning and setting every evening. You have the seasons come back year after year in a very predictable fashion. And this whole concept of cycles very much influenced the Egyptian outlook on life as well as the afterlife, and this influenced their art. Egyptian art is largely concerned with immortality. It is a culture that's very much fixated on the afterlife, at least in its visual products. And there's this sort of spiritual aspect that's overlaid onto the cycles that they saw in nature. So, for example, instead of the sun rising and setting, they viewed the sun as being born in the morning and then dying in the evening and traveling through the underworld at night. So the Egyptians had a circular, cyclical view of life. What has happened before will happen again. And they very much tied this to nature. Indeed, they saw the patterns of life and death everywhere. And this very much influenced their view of the afterlife, which is a good place to start talking about mummies, which is everybody's favorite thing to talk about with the Egyptians. The whole concept of mummification in ancient Egypt probably started when they just buried people in the sand and realized that the sand kind of dried out the bodies, and you might accidentally unearth a person who had been buried in the sand a few years later and see that they still had skin on them. So the ancient Egyptians developed the process of mummification to amplify this natural process they saw occurring with bodies buried in sand, and especially if you were an upper-class person, obviously pharaohs, but also high officials, you could afford more elaborate means of mummification. So here we have some images, a man and a woman. I believe the man on the left is Ramses the Great. And you can see how well preserved they are. Both of these figures have hair still. They have their skin on them. Their bodies are still largely intact. So the mummification process ensured that especially people of noble birth would have a body in the afterlife. The Egyptians had a pretty multifaceted conception of the soul. There are different parts of the soul, and what you need is a body or a substitute body for these parts of the soul to reside in after you died. And so mummification becomes extremely important if you want to have any quality of life in the afterlife. So keep that in mind, and let's move on to some Egyptian architecture that's absolutely going to tie in to these ideas of death. Let's start with some pyramids. Pyramids are the big thing that people often think of when they think of ancient Egypt. You may not, however, have seen this pyramid. This is called the Stepped Pyramid of Zoser, and this obviously shares some physical similarities to Mesopotamian ziggurats, and perhaps the ancient Egyptians were influenced by the terraced design of ziggurats. Also, the stepped pyramid of Zoser is built out of little tiny bricks, kind of like the ziggurats were. So there's probably another Mesopotamian architectural influence that is showing up here in this Egyptian architecture. However, the bricks that this pyramid is made of are actually stone, so they're not the mud baked or fired bricks that we saw in Mesopotamia. Now, this is different from a ziggurat, even though it shares some similarities. It's different in that it is a tomb. It is a tomb for the king Zoser, and ziggurats were not tombs. This is a noteworthy structure because, in part, of the name of the architect. It was a man named Imhotep, which for fans of the Mummy movies may recognize that name. This is probably where they got it. Imhotep was the architect who built the stepped pyramid of Zoser, or who planned it. And that's significant because this is the first name of an artist that we have in recorded history. So there's some good trivia question fodder for you. And from this Mesopotamian influence structure, we have subsequent pharaohs evolve the classic pyramid style. So here we see that in the Great Pyramids of Giza. Gone are the terraced levels, and now the sides are at an angle and they're smooth. These are very much a symbol of ancient Egypt. There are three pyramids that make up the Great Pyramids of Giza. The one in this picture in the foreground is the Pyramid of Menkaure. It's the smallest one. The one in the middle that looks like it has sort of a cap on it or some extra material on top is the Pyramid of Khafre. And the one in the distance in the background is the Pyramid of Khufu. It's actually the largest one out of all three. It just looks smaller in this picture because it's further away. The Great Pyramids, noteworthy not only for their just epic scale, especially Khufu and Khafre's pyramid, but also for the precision engineering that went into making them. And it's still a staggering feat of engineering for any ancient people to create. And it should be a reminder to us that just because people lived back in the day doesn't mean they were dumber than we were. There's a lot of great learning that has been lost. But back to these pyramids, they're oriented to the four cardinal directions. Each side of the pyramid faces exactly north, south, east, or west. The slopes are at extremely precise angles and completely consistent all the way around the pyramids. Originally, all three of these pyramids were covered in polished white limestone. So you have to imagine these pyramids not all sandy and dusty and crumbly looking, but glistening white in the desert sun, and perfectly smooth on their sides. That's how they originally looked. But, of course, 3,500 years of erosion have taken away some of that, and also they've been looted for their limestone. Some of that's been removed. The only part of that exterior limestone that still remains is on that middle pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafre, and that's what we see at the top. That is the original limestone facing that covered the whole pyramid, although now it's all eroded and isn't glistening white anymore. This next image shows the Pyramid of Khafre, the one we were just discussing, with a very famous icon of ancient Egypt in front of it. That, of course, is the Sphinx. The pyramids are not just by themselves. They tend to be part of mortuary complexes. There are buildings that are surrounding the pyramids. There are causeways and roads that lead to the pyramids. So when the pharaoh died, he would be taken to a temple near the pyramid, and there the mummification process would be carried out. And then there would be a ceremony in which the pharaoh's body would be taken down this road into the pyramid, and they're sealed inside his final resting place. The Pyramid of Khafre is the one that has the Sphinx beside it, And the Sphinx is probably a portrait of the pharaoh Khafre himself, the head of a human and the body of a lion. And speaking of sculptures of Pharaoh, our next image shows a sculpture of Menkaure. He's the dude associated with the Little Pyramid in the foreground that we saw in the earlier picture. And this is a sculpture of him and his wife. And this is classic Egyptian sculpture. Look at the face. The face is kind of generic and idealized. His body is perfect. He has an impressive inverted triangle figure. He's idealized because, of course, the pharaohs are believed to be god kings. And so if you're portraying the pharaoh needs to look perfect. But if you look at this sculpture, this illustrates to a T kind of the Egyptian aesthetic. Solid, monumental. Look at the space between Menkaure and his queen, and you can see it's still filled with rock. It's like the sculptor didn't drill out any holes for the legs or between the legs or anything like that. This is a sculpture that has really barely escaped from the stone that it is carved in. It still feels very monumental. And notice there are no like arms or legs really sticking out. Everything is kept really close to the body. Notice too that the walking stance he is in is not very realistic. Both feet are flat on the ground, which isn't really how we walk, right? When we walk, we are in a state of sort of arrested falling, and usually one foot is flat on the ground and the other one is bent. But here we don't have the Egyptians really capturing a naturalistic sense of movement. We don't have a sense that they are trying to reproduce exactly what the action of walking is like. Instead, they're much more interested in having this solid, imposing, monumental sculpture. And that's something we see in societies that are focused on eternity or the spiritual world. We often see art that is not very realistic. And that's because the artists of that culture are much more interested in portraying invisible spiritual realities than they are looking at the world around them and copying it. And that's certainly the case for ancient Egypt. And where we really see this is in Egyptian painting. This next image shows a wall painting from the tomb of Nabaman, and this is in Thebes. And here we have a pharaoh hunting. He is thrashing some papyrus bushes with a rod and flail, and there are all these birds flying out of it. So I guess it's like sending your dogs out if you're duck hunting to make the ducks fly. But look at how the body of the male figure is depicted. And here, again, just like the cave artists, we have an ancient people wrestling with how to depict a three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. And so the way that Egyptians portray bodies is this really kind of strange mix of different angles. We have the chest facing forward. We have the head turned to the side, but we have the eye facing forward. The arms are to the side, the legs are to the side, and notice that his right hand has a left-handed fist on it, so that's something the artist didn't quite get right. And this is just how the Egyptians painted people. This is the standard kind of cookie-cutter way that they did it. And their way of depicting the human figure does not change for thousands of years. Once they found a way that worked, they just kept on doing it. And again, this is a hallmark of a society that is fixated on the afterlife. Now, we do have one interesting, unusual, weird exception to this trend in Egyptian visual culture. We have a pharaoh come along whose name is Akhenaten. And when he comes into power, he basically decrees that only one god in Egypt may be worshipped, Aten, the actual god associated with the disk or circle of the sun. There are different sun gods in ancient Egypt, and the god that this pharaoh chose to worship was the one associated with the actual circle of the sun. So Akhenaten comes into power, and he tells polytheistic Egypt, Egypt, you are now monotheistic, and you may only worship Aten. So he drives other priests out of their temples. Any priest associated with a deity other than Aten is banished, and you're not allowed to worship any deities. So for a brief period of time, this is about in the 1350s BC, Egypt becomes monotheistic. And during this time, there are some strange changes that happen in Egyptian artwork under Akhenaten's reign. This is something Egyptologists call the Amarna period. So look at this next image. This is a sculpture of Akhenaten, and I want you to compare it to the sculpture of Menkaure that we looked at earlier. Think about how Menkaure is idealized and sort of has a perfect body. In comparison, this is a weird looking sculpture. The face is elongated, the lips are really plump. If you look at his actual figure, it almost looks like the figure of a woman. It doesn't even look very masculine. And a lot of theories have been raised about this. Perhaps Akhenaten had some sort of birth defects that led to him being portrayed this way. Other theories suggest that he wants to combine the concept of male and female in one image. So he is kind of a father and a mother to the Egyptian people all in one image. We don't know for sure. Maybe someday we will find out. But here's what we do know. During Akhenaten's reign, Egyptian art changed for a very brief period. Sometimes it became just kind of weirder and different, like we see in Akhenaten's statue. Other times it became more realistic and more naturalistic, as we see in the next image, a bust of a queen named Nefertiti. And Nefertiti was one of the wives of Akhenaten. And this is one of the most famous Egyptian sculptures. She has this reputation for being really beautiful, and if you look at her, she is quite striking. High cheekbones and a slender neck, beautiful facial structure. So Nefertiti, the sculpture of Nefertiti, has become an icon of feminine beauty for many years. But notice this sculpture has a certain realism to it that the sculpture of Menkaure's wife didn't have. There's something a little bit better proportioned about this. It seems that during Akhenaten's reign, artists were given more license to work in new ways, and when they did work, they went more realistic. They tended to look at nature and how people actually look to depict human beings in their sculptures. So that's pretty cool, but Akhenaten's reign is obviously not forever, and his son comes into power and restores Egypt to polytheism. His son reinstates all the gods who had been banished, and Egyptian art goes back to how it was. His son didn't reign for very long, only a few years. He came onto the throne at a young age and died when he was just out of his teenage years. He was a minor pharaoh. However, he is now the most famous pharaoh, in large part because of the circumstances surrounding the discovery of his tomb. Tutankhamun's tomb was one of the few royal burial sites that remained intact, unlooted and unmolested by tomb robbers. You see, what happened, pharaohs would build these big pyramids, which is kind of the equivalent of putting up a big billboard or sign that says, "Please rob me," or "Please loot me," "Please break in and take all the gold and treasures that you want." And after a while, pharaohs begin to go for a more subtle approach, because remember, they want their bodies and all their stuff preserved for the afterlife, so the parts of their soul have a place to live. So some of these pharaohs wised up and said, hey, let's not build pyramids anymore. Let's go for the whole buried in the side of a hill thing. And that's what we have with Tutankhamun. He's buried in a place called the Valley of the Kings, along with a lot of other royal type burials. And because of Egyptian records, Egyptologists knew that he had lived and reigned for a brief period of time, but his tomb for many years had never been found until a British archaeologist named Howard Carter set out to find the final resting place of Tutankhamun. Here's a picture of Howard Carter and his patron, Lord Carnarvon, both British, And Carter had spent a lot of his life in ancient Egypt when he was a younger man, and he made it his mission to find King Tut's tomb. So he began digging in 1917, and he was excavating in the Valley of the Kings, and he was digging out rubble, and he was having his workers place this rubble in the only available spot, which happened to be the entrance to another tomb that was a popular tourist attraction. And the tourists didn't really go for that, so he said, well, this is causing a problem. I think I'll dig somewhere else for a little while. And that's what he did for the next 5 years. He digs in different places in the Valley of the Kings and finds nothing, always looking for a sealed door with an inscription or a cartouche that would have Tutankhamun's name on it, but he doesn't find it. And after several years of fruitless digging, in 1922, he says, well, let's go back to the place we started in 1917. And so that's what they did, and they found a stairway. They cleared out the stairway and saw steps descending, going down to a sealed door, and they were like, cool. So Carter gets on the telegraph or whatever he had during that time and contacts Carnarvon and says, get here, you need to be here for the opening of the tomb because we found it. And that's sure enough what happens. Carnarvon comes and is looking over Howard Carter's shoulder when Carter makes that first incision in the sealed door to Tutankhamun's tomb. And what follows is one of the most famous dramatic moments in the history of archaeology. Carter makes a hole in the door, and when he makes the hole, this stale 2,500-year-old air comes rushing out. It's been trapped there for a long time. He thrusts a light into the dark room, and Lord Carnarvon, anxiously peering over his shoulder, says, do you see anything? And Howard Carter utters those famous words, yes, wonderful things, because everywhere is the glint of gold shining in the darkness. They open the tomb, and it's noteworthy because all of Tutankhamun's stuff is intact. You can see this next slide. And it's not just about the gold, and it's not about the treasure, it's about what sort of stuff were the pharaohs buried with. And what they found was all sorts of useful stuff for the afterlife. You have chariots, you have furniture, you have food, you have little sculptures of people that were intended to come to life after the pharaoh died and be his servants. So this discovery is a really complete snapshot into Egyptian burial practices and also sort of how pharaohs were treated in the afterlife. So Carter spent basically the rest of his life excavating this tomb and cataloging all the objects. And this discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb is in many ways what led to the rise of mummy curse stories. For shortly after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon dies. He's shaving and he has a mosquito bite that gets infected as he shaves over it. And he contracts blood poisoning and dies. And some strange circumstances happened around the time of Lord Carnarvon's death. All the lights mysteriously flicker out in Cairo for a brief period of time. Back in England, Carnarvon's dog begins to howl and then drops over dead. So these mysterious circumstances surrounding his death, people begin to start muttering about the curse of the pharaoh and how tombs should not be disturbed. This is the pharaoh getting revenge. There are other people related to this excavation who die, but Howard Carter is not among them, at least immediately. He lives to a pretty ripe old age, and as one Egyptologist has noted, if there really were a curse of the pharaohs, there would be no living Egyptologists around today. Well, that wraps up our first stop on the Grand Tour, our examination of prehistoric and early art. We're going to pick up with the Greeks and the Romans in our next module, so pack your bags and get ready to go to the sunny Mediterranean.